October 27th, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The jungle darkness pressed against the perimeter like a physical weight. Corporal Tony Stein crouched in his fighting hole, hands wrapped around the .30 caliber Browning M1919A4 that battalion had dismissed as inadequate for mobile jungle warfare. Too slow to reposition, they said, too heavy for rapid advances, better suited for the static battles of the last war than the fluid, close quarters fighting that defined the Pacific campaign. But as the sound of hundreds of Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle reached his ears, as the distant crack of rifle fire signaled that the enemy offensive had begun, Stein wasn't thinking about what headquarters considered adequate. He was thinking about mathematics that couldn't be argued with: one Marine, one air-cooled machine gun, and a 4-hour night ahead that would test whether sustained fire could stop human waves when retreat wasn't an option. The radio in the command post had gone silent 20 minutes ago. No orders, no reinforcements, no promises, just the unmistakable sound of a major Japanese assault building in the darkness beyond the wire, and the cold certainty that the next 4 hours would prove whether obsolete weapons and stubborn determination could hold a defensive line that doctrine said should have already collapsed. The afternoon of October 26th had brought deceptive quiet to the southern approach of Henderson Field. Corporal Tony Stein had spent the morning hours checking and rechecking his gun position, a ritual that combined superstition with tactical necessity in equal measure. His sector, a 100-yard stretch of cleared ground between dense jungle and the vital airstrip, represented what military planners called a secondary defensive position, important enough to man but expendable enough that reinforcements would be difficult to justify if things went wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His weapon, the Browning M1919A4, represented the Marine Corps' attempt to modernize the heavy machine gun concept for mobile warfare. At 41 pounds, without its tripod, the weapon was significantly lighter than the water-cooled M1917 that had dominated the previous war. The air-cooled barrel eliminated the need for water jackets and cooling systems, reducing complexity and weight. But this modernization came with a crucial limitation. Without water cooling, sustained fire would heat the barrel to temperatures that could warp metal and ignite ammunition. Doctrine specified barrel changes every 75 to 100 rounds of continuous fire, a requirement that assumed multiple gunners and spare barrels would be available during extended engagements. Stein's position had neither. His assistant gunner had been evacuated 3 days earlier with malaria that had reduced the young Marine to 120 pounds of fever and delirium. Replacement personnel were being held at battalion level for what intelligence suggested would be a major Japanese offensive somewhere along the perimeter. His spare barrel had been requisitioned 2 weeks earlier for a weapon that had suffered catastrophic failure during a night engagement. The supply sergeant had promised a replacement within 48 hours, but 48 hours had stretched into 14 days, and promises meant nothing in a campaign where ammunition and medical supplies took priority over equipment redundancy. What Stein did have was ammunition, 3,200 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, carefully arranged in 250-round belts, protected from the jungle humidity by canvas covers scavenged from abandoned supply dumps. He had sandbags stacked in a semicircle that provided cover from frontal fire while allowing lateral movement if repositioning became necessary. He had fields of fire that extended nearly 400 yards to the jungle edge, with natural choke points where enemy forces would be channeled into predetermined kill zones. And he had 8 hours of darkness ahead, during which Japanese forces would attempt to exploit what their reconnaissance had correctly identified as a thinly held section of the American defensive perimeter. The tactical mathematics were brutally simple. Intelligence estimates suggested a reinforced Japanese company, perhaps 200 men, would be committed to this sector as part of a larger offensive designed to overwhelm American positions through simultaneous pressure at multiple points. Standard doctrine assumed that each Marine could engage effectively at ranges up to 300 yards with rifle fire, accounting for perhaps a dozen enemy casualties before defensive positions were overrun. Machine gun fire could multiply this effectiveness, but only if the weapon remained operational throughout the engagement. If ammunition held out, and if the gunner could maintain accurate fire despite the inevitable return fire that would target his position once his muzzle flash revealed his location. Stein understood that his M1919A4, dismissed by mobile warfare advocates as too cumbersome and too limited by its cooling requirements, represented the difference between holding this sector and watching Japanese forces pour through a gap that would expose Henderson Field to direct assault. The weapon's air-cooled design meant he would have perhaps 3 minutes of sustained fire before barrel temperatures reached critical levels. After that, he would face a choice between continuing to fire and risking catastrophic weapon failure, or ceasing fire to allow cooling while Japanese assault waves advanced uncontested. The afternoon light faded slowly through the jungle canopy, transforming green shadows into grey uncertainty. Stein performed his final pre-combat checks with the methodical precision of a man who understood that survival depended entirely on preparation. Belt feed mechanism tested for smooth operation, tripod legs positioned for stability and rapid traverse, spare belts arranged for quick access, sight picture verified against known reference points in the killing ground. Private First Class Jimmy Matsuda crawled into the fighting position just before dark, carrying a Thompson submachine gun and a canvas bag filled with hand grenades. The young Japanese-American Marine had been reassigned from a rifle squad after his platoon commander decided that his language skills might prove useful if interrogation opportunities arose. His presence represented both tactical advantage and command's acknowledgement that Stein's position was considered critical enough to warrant a second man, even if that man carried weapons unsuited for sustained defensive fire. Corporal, battalion says the Japanese are moving in force along the Matanikau approaches, Matsuda reported, settling into the fighting hole with the practiced economy of movement that characterized experienced jungle fighters. Intelligence estimates regimental strength, possibly more. Our sector is designated as a secondary approach, but if the main attack gets stopped, they'll probably probe here looking for weak points. Stein absorbed this information while continuing his weapons check. Secondary approach meant their position would face whatever Japanese forces decided that frontal assaults against primary defenses were too costly. It meant facing soldiers who had already been bloodied, already understood American defensive capabilities, and already possessed the tactical flexibility to exploit perceived weaknesses in the defensive line. "How many Marines we got holding this sector?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Battalion says 2 machine gun positions, rifle squads at intervals, maybe 40 Marines total for 1,000 yards of perimeter. Matsuda's voice carried the flat tone of a man reciting facts that didn't require editorial comment. "We're it for this 100 yards. Next gun position is 200 yards south, covering the ravine approach." The isolation was both liberating and terrifying. No adjacent units meant no one to coordinate with, no one to provide covering fire if his position became untenable, but also no one whose mistakes or bad luck would compromise his sector. Success or failure would be determined entirely by his weapons performance and his ability to make tactical decisions without guidance from higher command. As full darkness settled over the defensive perimeter, the jungle sounds began to change. The normal evening chorus of insects and night birds gradually diminished, replaced by a silence that experienced Marines recognized as unnatural. Something was moving through the jungle in numbers sufficient to suppress the ambient wildlife. Something that understood stealth but couldn't entirely conceal the sound. The of many men moving through dense vegetation. Stein settled behind his machine gun, hands finding the familiar grips, thumbs testing the trigger mechanism one final time. The M1919A4 represented 25 years of evolution from the original Browning design, refinements that had reduced weight and increased portability while maintaining the fundamental advantage that made machine guns decisive in defensive warfare. Sustained fire that would shred infantry formations advancing across open ground. But sustained fire required a barrel that could withstand the heat generated by hundreds of rounds fired in rapid succession, and air-cooled designs had fundamental limitations that no amount of engineering refinement could entirely eliminate. The weapon Stein depended on for survival had a theoretical limitation that measured his effectiveness in minutes rather than hours. After that, he would be betting his life on whether the barrel could handle punishment that exceeded its design specifications, whether the weapon would continue functioning when doctrine said it should fail. The first mortar rounds began falling on the perimeter at 2100 hours, a preparatory bombardment designed to suppress defensive positions and create confusion before the main assault began. Stein pressed himself against the bottom of his fighting hole while explosions walked across the defensive line, searching for gun positions and command posts. The tactical pattern was familiar from dozens of previous engagements. Japanese forces would bombard American positions for 15 to 20 minutes, then launch their assault while defenders were still recovering from the bombardment's shock effect. But this bombardment continued for nearly an hour, a sustained pounding that suggested the Japanese commander was committing significant resources to this offensive. When the explosions finally ceased, the silence that followed was more ominous than the bombardment itself. Somewhere in that darkness, hundreds of enemy soldiers were preparing to advance, confident that American defensive positions had been weakened sufficiently to allow breakthrough. Stein raised his head above the sandbag line, scanning the killing ground with eyes that had adapted to the tropical darkness. Movement at the jungle edge, perhaps 150 yards distant. Not the careful infiltration of a reconnaissance patrol, but the deliberate advance of an assault formation that believed surprise had been achieved. The Japanese had correctly identified his sector as lightly held, had assessed that one or two machine guns could be overwhelmed through concentrated assault, and were now committing forces that would test whether doctrine or determination would prevail in the next 4 hours. His hands found the machine gun's grips as the first enemy soldiers emerged from the tree line into the cleared ground that would become their graveyard or his tomb. Depending entirely on whether an air-cooled weapon dismissed as too slow for modern warfare could deliver the sustained fire that survival demanded. The assault began, not with the screaming banzai charges that American propaganda films would later immortalize, but with the methodical advance of experienced infantry who understood that stealth and fire discipline would carry them across the kill zone more effectively than suicidal courage. Stein watched through the M1919A4's sights as Japanese soldiers moved in loose formations, using what little cover the terrain offered, advancing in short rushes between covered positions. He waited. Every instinct screamed to open fire immediately, to engage targets while they were still at maximum range, to begin the harvest before enemy forces could close to grenade range. But the discipline, born from months of jungle combat, overrode instinct. The first burst had to be decisive, had to catch the maximum number of targets in the open, had to create immediate casualties that would disrupt the assault's momentum and force Japanese squad leaders to abandon their careful approach in favor of desperate rushes that would expose their men to sustained fire. At 100 yards, Stein pressed the trigger. The M1919A4 responded with the familiar hammering rhythm that characterized all Browning designs, a mechanical percussion that transformed belted ammunition into a stream of 30-caliber rounds that swept across the advancing formation. The first burst caught a dozen soldiers in the open, men who had been advancing confidently toward what they believed was an unmanned sector, suddenly finding themselves under fire from a weapon that should not have been operational after the bombardment they had just witnessed. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Japanese advance faltered as men sought cover, as squad leaders attempted to identify the source of fire as the carefully planned assault dissolved into reactive confusion. But Stein knew this advantage would last only moments before enemy forces adapted, before return fire began targeting his muzzle flash, before the reality of his isolation became apparent to Japanese commanders who would then commit overwhelming force against a position they correctly assessed as held by minimal forces. He fired in controlled bursts, 5 to 7 round sequences that conserved ammunition while maintaining continuous pressure on the stalled assault. The M1919A4 performed flawlessly, belt feeding smoothly through the mechanism, and spent brass ejecting in a steady stream that accumulated around the gun position. The barrel began to heat within the first 30 seconds of firing, metal warming from the friction and explosive pressure that transformed solid rounds into lethal projectiles. Matsuda crouched beside him, feeding ammunition belts and calling out targets that Stein's focused attention might miss. Flanking movement left, 50 yards, squad-sized element using that fallen tree for cover. Beikate's information allowed Stein to shift fire, catching Japanese soldiers as they attempted to maneuver around his position's eastern approach. 3 minutes into the engagement, the barrel temperature had reached levels that would concern any gunner who understood metallurgy and heat stress. The weapon continued to function, but Stein could feel the change in its operation. A subtle resistance in the belt feed, a slight hesitation in the cyclic rate. The air-cooled design was approaching its theoretical limit, the point where continued firing risked catastrophic failure that would transform his machine gun into useless metal. Doctrine demanded a barrel change. Training insisted that continuing to fire would destroy the weapon. But doctrine assumed spare barrels would be available, and training assumed survival didn't depend entirely on sustained fire from a single weapon. Stein kept firing, accepting the risk because the alternative was watching Japanese forces advance uncontested to positions from which they could assault his fighting hole with grenades and close-quarters weapons. At 5 minutes, the barrel was glowing visibly in the darkness, a dull red heat that would have been alarming under any other circumstances. The weapon's cyclic rate had dropped noticeably, rounds feeding slightly slower as heat expanded metal components beyond their design tolerances. Japanese return fire was becoming more accurate as enemy soldiers identified his position and began concentrating rifle and machine gun fire on his sandbag parapet. "Corporal, you're going to melt that barrel if you keep this up," Matsuda shouted over the sustained gunfire, his concern evident even through the chaos of combat. "Yeah, and if I stop firing, we're going to get overrun in about 2 minutes," Stein responded, shifting fire to engage a new group of soldiers attempting to advance during what they hoped was a cooling break. The tactical reality was brutally simple. His weapon was operating beyond its design specifications, functioning in conditions that should have caused failure minutes ago. But Japanese forces had been stopped, their assault stalled by sustained fire from a single machine gun that refused to fail, despite every technical reason it should have. Bodies were accumulating in the kill zone, forcing subsequent waves to advance over fallen comrades while machine gun fire continued to rake the approach routes. At 8 minutes, something fundamental changed in the weapon's operation. The barrel, stressed beyond any reasonable limit, should have warped or ruptured. Instead, it seemed to reach a thermal equilibrium, where additional heat was dissipated as quickly as it was generated. The cyclic rate stabilized, the belt feed smoothed out. The M1919A4 had been tortured beyond its specifications and had somehow survived to continue functioning. Stein didn't question this mechanical miracle. He simply adjusted his fire pattern, maintaining pressure on enemy positions while conserving ammunition for the extended engagement he now understood was inevitable. The Japanese assault had been stopped, but not broken. Enemy forces were adapting, repositioning, calling up reinforcements that would test whether his unexpected success was temporary or whether one Marine with a machine gun that refused to quit could hold 100 yards of perimeter against forces that doctrine said should have overrun his position 10 minutes ago. The Japanese commander was learning what Stein had already discovered through necessity. The M1919A4, stressed beyond its theoretical operating limits, had become something its designers never intended, a weapon capable of sustained fire that rivaled water-cooled systems while maintaining the portability advantages of air-cooled designs. But this capability came at a cost that would only become apparent when the engagement ended and the weapon could be properly inspected. By the 15-minute mark, Stein had expended nearly 800 rounds of ammunition, a consumption rate that would exhaust his supply in less than an hour if maintained. The tactical situation demanded adjustment. Rather than continuous fire, he shifted to disciplined bursts, timed to catch enemy movement, allowing the barrel brief moments of cooling while maintaining sufficient pressure to prevent coordinated Japanese advances. The enemy was probing now, testing different approaches to his position. Small groups of 3 to 5 soldiers would attempt rushes from various angles, while others provided covering fire. It was sound infantry tactics designed to identify weak points in defensive coverage, to force the defender to divide attention among multiple threats, to create opportunities for grenades or close assault weapons to neutralize machine gun positions. Matsuda's Thompson submachine gun cracked repeatedly as Japanese soldiers closed to within 50 yards, his shorter-ranged weapon proving effective against infiltrators who had worked their way through the kill zone during Stein's necessary focus on larger threats. The two-man defense was working, but barely. Each enemy soldier who reached close range represented a potential breakthrough, a moment when the machine gun's advantage disappeared and personal weapons determined survival. "Corporal, they're massing on the left flank," Matsuda called out, pointing toward a cluster of movement barely visible in the darkness. "Looks like they're setting up for a coordinated push." Stein traversed the M1919A4 to cover the indicated sector, waiting for the assault he knew was coming. Japanese forces had absorbed their initial casualties, assessed his position's strengths and limitations, and were now committing reserves in an attempt to overwhelm his defensive fire through numerical superiority. This was the moment when doctrine said his position should fail, when a single machine gun could not possibly deliver sufficient firepower to stop a determined assault by squad-level forces attacking from multiple directions. The assault came as a synchronized rush by approximately 30 soldiers advancing in 3 groups from different angles. Stein opened fire on the nearest formation, cutting down the lead elements before traversing to engage the second group. His sustained fire forced the third group to ground, but they were using the distraction to advance by bounds, each rush bringing them closer to his position. The barrel was beyond any temperature that peacetime training would have tolerated. Metal glowed cherry red in the darkness, heat radiating in waves that distorted the air above the weapon. The belt feed mechanism was functioning despite thermal expansion that should have jammed the system. Stein understood he was witnessing something that armory manuals would declare impossible, an air-cooled machine gun delivering sustained fire for over 20 minutes without catastrophic failure. But impossible or not, the weapon was holding together long enough to matter. The Japanese assault was breaking up, dissolving into individual survivors seeking cover while their companions died in the killing ground. The coordinated push that should have overrun his position had been stopped by firepower that refused to diminish, regardless of how long the engagement continued. At 30 minutes into the battle, a lull developed as Japanese forces regrouped and reassessed. Stein used the break to redistribute ammunition, bringing fresh belts forward while Matsuda provided security. The momentary silence was broken only by the groans of wounded men scattered across the approaches, sounds that both Marines had learned to compartmentalize as simply another aspect of jungle warfare. "How's the gun holding up?" Matsuda asked, eyeing the still glowing barrel with professional concern. "Still shooting," Stein replied, which was the only answer that mattered. Technical analysis could wait for morning, assuming they survived to see morning. What mattered now was that the M1919A4 remained operational, despite treatment that should have destroyed it, and Japanese forces showed no signs of breaking off their assault. The second major assault began at the 40-minute mark, this time with better coordination and supporting fire. Japanese machine guns positioned in the jungle tree line opened up on Stein's position, forcing him to keep his head down while enemy infantry advanced during the suppressive fire. It was professional tactics, executed by experienced soldiers who had learned from their initial failures. Stein waited until the suppressive fire lifted, then raised his weapon and engaged the advancing infantry at ranges under 75 yards. The closer distance meant his fire was devastatingly effective, each burst finding targets that had little room to maneuver, but it also meant Japanese grenades were now reaching his position, forcing both Marines to hunker behind sandbags while explosions peppered their fighting hole with fragments. The fighting reached a crescendo of violence where survival was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Matsuda's Thompson hammered at point-blank range as Japanese soldiers reached the perimeter wire. Stein traversed his machine gun with desperate speed, engaging targets so close he could see individual faces in his muzzle flash. The M1919A4 never faltered, never jammed, never failed, despite operating continuously at temperatures and cyclic rates that exceeded every specification its manufacturers had established. A Japanese grenade landed in the fighting hole, and Matsuda's instant reaction saved both their lives. He scooped the explosive and hurled it back toward the enemy, where it detonated among advancing soldiers. The blast stunned both Marines, but Stein's hands found his machine gun's grips through muscle memory, resuming fire before his hearing fully returned. The assault broke at 55 minutes, enemy forces falling back in disorder after suffering casualties that made continued advance impossible. Stein maintained harassing fire as they withdrew, punishing the retreat and reinforcing the lesson that his position remained operational despite everything Japanese forces had thrown at it. The tactical accounting was sobering. Stein had expended nearly 1,700 rounds of ammunition, more than half his supply. The barrel showed visible warping, metal stress that would require replacement as soon as spare parts became available. More critically, Japanese forces had demonstrated they could reach his position despite his firepower and could coordinate assaults that came dangerously close to overwhelming his defense. The next attack might succeed where previous attempts had failed, but Henderson Field remained secure behind him. The airstrip's runways still operational, still capable of launching the aircraft that made American offensive operations possible throughout the Solomon Islands. Every minute his position held was another minute for reinforcements to arrive, for defensive preparations to strengthen elsewhere on the perimeter, for the broader battle to develop in ways that favored American forces. As the first hour of combat ended, Stein understood with absolute clarity that the next 3 hours would determine whether his improbable success was temporary or whether one Marine with a machine gun that refused to die could achieve what doctrine said was impossible. The mathematics remained unchanged. Approximately 100 Japanese soldiers still combat effectively versus one machine gun with 1,600 rounds of ammunition remaining. The barrel that should have failed 40 minutes ago was still functioning. The position that should have been overrun was still holding, and the night was far from over. The second hour of fighting developed into a pattern that combined Japanese tactical adaptation with Stein's growing understanding of his weapons' capabilities under extreme conditions. Enemy forces had abandoned frontal assaults in favor of infiltration tactics, small groups attempting to work their way close enough to use grenades and close assault weapons while avoiding the devastating firepower that had broken their earlier attacks. Stein adjusted his defensive approach accordingly. Rather than maintaining continuous observation over the entire kill zone, he focused on likely infiltration routes, conserving ammunition while positioning himself to deliver maximum effect when targets presented themselves. The M1919A4 had cooled slightly during the lull, though the barrel remained hot enough to raise blisters on exposed skin. The weapon's continued functionality defied every technical principle Stein understood about metallurgy and heat stress. Matsuda had repositioned to cover the fighting hole's rear approaches, his Thompson providing security against infiltrators who might circle around the machine gun's primary field of fire. Their two-man defense had evolved into an effective system where each Marine covered the other's blind spots, where communication was reduced to hand signals and brief warnings, where survival depended on trust, developed through shared combat experience. The Japanese probes came at irregular intervals, denying the Marines any opportunity to relax or assume the assault had ended. 3 soldiers would appear at the wire, forcing Stein to engage, while another group used the distraction to advance from a different angle. It was exhausting work that demanded constant vigilance, that burned through ammunition in bursts rather than sustained fire, that tested whether physical endurance could outlast tactical pressure. At 1 hour and 40 minutes into the engagement, Stein's ammunition supply had dropped below 1,000 rounds, a psychological threshold that marked the transition from adequate supply to genuine concern about running dry before the battle ended. He adjusted his fire discipline further, engaging only targets that presented immediate threats, allowing more distant movement to go unchallenged unless it developed into direct assault. The Japanese commander seemed to sense the ammunition constraint, increasing the tempo of probes in an apparent attempt to force Stein to expend his remaining supply. Squad-sized elements would advance to within 100 yards, close enough to demand response, but far enough to require sustained fire to achieve decisive results. It was sound tactics, designed to exploit the fundamental limitation of any defensive position, finite ammunition that would eventually be exhausted, regardless of how effectively it was employed. But Stein had learned something during that first hour of combat that now guided his tactical decisions. The M1919A4's sustained fire capability, even operating beyond its design specifications, created a psychological effect on enemy forces that exceeded its physical impact. Japanese soldiers who had watched their comrades cut down by machine gun fire developed caution that slowed their advances, made them seek cover when movement was necessary, and transformed confident assault troops into hesitant infantrymen who understood that exposure meant death. He began using short bursts not to achieve casualties, but to manipulate enemy movement. A 5-round burst would force a Japanese squad to ground, pinning them in positions where Matsuda's grenades could reach them or where they blocked the advance of follow-on forces. Another burst would catch soldiers attempting to withdraw, reinforcing the impression that his position maintained complete coverage of all approach routes. The machine gun was becoming a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, its presence dominating the tactical decision-making of enemy forces even when it wasn't actively firing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 2 hours, the tactical situation had stabilized into a deadly equilibrium. Japanese forces continued probing Stein's position, but lacked the combat strength or coordination to mount another major assault. Stein continued engaging targets, but recognized his ammunition supply could not sustain another hour of combat at current consumption rates. Both sides were approaching exhaustion, physical and material, where the battle's outcome would be determined by whichever force could maintain effectiveness the longest. The Marines' physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Neither man had slept properly in 3 days. Combat stress and the sustained adrenaline of close-quarters fighting were extracting tolls that would only become apparent when the engagement ended. Stein's hands shook when he wasn't actively firing, fine tremors that spoke of nervous system overload. Matsuda's movements had slowed, reactions dulled by exhaustion that made even simple tasks demanding. But the Japanese forces, visible in the killing ground, showed similar signs of degradation. Their probes were less coordinated, their movements more hesitant, their tactical decision-making more conservative, and the assault force that had begun the evening with confidence and numerical superiority had been ground down by sustained defensive fire into a depleted formation that lacked the strength to achieve its objectives. At 2 hours and 30 minutes, Marine artillery began falling on Japanese positions in the jungle beyond Stein's sector. The delayed fire support indicated that higher command had finally established communication with forward observers and was beginning to coordinate defensive fires across the entire perimeter. The psychological impact on enemy forces was immediate. Soldiers who had been preparing for another assault instead sought cover from high explosive rounds that made continued offensive operations impossible. The artillery barrage lasted 15 minutes, a concentrated pounding that shattered whatever tactical cohesion Japanese Forces had maintained. When the explosions ceased, the infiltration attempts had stopped. The sounds of movement through the jungle were now clearly audible as withdrawal sounds rather than assault preparations. Enemy forces were breaking contact, abandoning their objective in favor of survival and retreat to positions beyond American artillery range. Stein maintained his position behind the M1919A4, scanning the kill zone for any indication that the withdrawal was a feint designed to lower his guard before a final assault, but the sounds continued to recede, fading into the jungle darkness until only the normal night sounds remained. The 4-hour battle was ending, not with climactic confrontation, but with the quiet recognition by both sides that continued combat would achieve nothing beyond additional casualties. At 3 hours and 45 minutes, Matsuda crawled to Stein's position with a canteen of water that tasted like the finest meal either Marine had ever consumed. They sat in silence, too exhausted for conversation, watching the approaches while their bodies processed the reality that immediate death was no longer imminent. "Think they'll come back?" Matsuda finally asked, his voice hoarse from shouting commands and breathing cordite smoke for 4 hours. Stein studied the kill zone, counting the dark shapes scattered across the approach routes. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever after what that cost them." The weapon that had saved their lives sat cooling between them, its barrel warped visibly even in darkness, its finish burned away by heat that should have destroyed it hours ago. The M1919A4 that headquarters had dismissed as too slow, too limited, too constrained by its cooling requirements had delivered sustained fire for nearly 4 hours while operating beyond every specification its manufacturers had established. As dawn approached and the tactical situation stabilized across the entire perimeter, the scope of the night's fighting became clear through radio reports from adjacent sectors. Japanese forces had attacked simultaneously at multiple points, probing for weak spots that could be exploited for breakthrough. Most attacks had been repulsed with varying degrees of difficulty, but several sectors had required reinforcement when initial defenses proved inadequate. Stein's sector, the secondary approach that command had assessed as low priority, had held without reinforcement, despite facing forces that should have overrun a 2-man position. The weapon that doctrine said should have failed had functioned flawlessly when failure meant death, and Henderson Field remained secure, its strategic importance preserved by Marines who refused to yield ground, regardless of what textbooks said was possible. Dawn arrived slowly over Henderson Field, grey light filtering through smoke that still hung over defensive positions like morning fog. Corporal Tony Stein remained at his machine gun, scanning approaches that now revealed the full cost of the night's fighting. Bodies lay scattered across the killing ground in patterns that traced the evolution of Japanese tactical attempts. Dense clusters where initial assaults had been stopped, scattered individuals where infiltration tactics had been attempted, and irregular trails that marked withdrawal routes taken by survivors. The M1919A4 sat silent now, its barrel cooled enough to touch, but showing damage that made its continued functionality seem miraculous. The metal was discolored along its entire length, heat-stressed to the point where precise tolerances had been compromised. Visible warping was apparent, even to casual observation. The weapon should have failed spectacularly somewhere during the 3rd hour of sustained fire, should have jammed or ruptured or simply ceased functioning when thermal expansion exceeded mechanical tolerances. Instead, it had continued operating through 4 hours of combat that consumed over 2,100 rounds of ammunition, delivered sustained fire at rates and durations exceeding its design specifications by factors that would concern any weapons engineer. The Browning design's fundamental reliability had been tested beyond any reasonable limit and had somehow survived to prove that actual battlefield performance could exceed theoretical calculations when survival demanded the impossible. Matsuda had moved forward to the perimeter wire, checking for wounded and ensuring that no Japanese soldiers remained concealed in positions where they could threaten the defensive line once full daylight arrived. Thompson remained at the ready, but his movements showed the exhaustion that came from 4 hours of combat where death had been measured in inches and seconds rather than tactical abstractions. Lieutenant Hal Sorensen arrived with a squad from the reserve platoon as the sun cleared the jungle canopy, his expression showing professional assessment mixed with genuine surprise. He had monitored radio reports throughout the night, understanding that Stein's sector had been engaged continuously, but the visual evidence of sustained fighting exceeded what sparse communications had suggested. "Corporal Stein," he began, surveying the kill zone with practiced eyes that could read tactical stories from body positions and equipment distribution. "Battalion was preparing to send reinforcements to your sector around 0200 hours, but you reported the situation under control. That assessment appears to have been accurate." Stein gestured toward the scattered evidence of Japanese casualties. "Sir, they kept coming in groups, never enough at once to overrun the position, but enough to keep us engaged continuously. The gun held together. That's what made the difference." The lieutenant examined the M1919A4 with the interest of someone who understood weapon systems and their limitations. The barrel damage was immediately apparent, as was the wear on the belt feed mechanism and the heat discoloration that extended to the receiver housing. "This weapon should not be operational, Corporal. I've never seen an air-cooled gun that's been stressed this badly without catastrophic failure." "Yes, sir. But it kept shooting when shooting was what we needed." The body count began at full daylight as Marine patrols moved carefully through the killing ground, checking fallen enemy soldiers and recovering equipment that might provide intelligence value. The numbers accumulated slowly as counting parties worked their way from the perimeter wire outward to the jungle edge where the first casualties had fallen during the initial assault. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, tasked with compiling the casualty assessment, arrived at Stein's position with preliminary figures that reflected the effectiveness of sustained defensive fire delivered from a single weapon. "Corporal, we're counting 187 confirmed Japanese casualties in your direct sector of fire. That's not including wounded who made it back to their lines or bodies that might be in the jungle beyond our patrol limit." The number was staggering, representing nearly complete destruction of the assault force that had attacked through this approach. 187 enemy soldiers killed by sustained machine gun fire, delivered by a single Marine with a weapon that doctrine said should have failed within the first 30 minutes of combat. Matsuda provided additional tactical details from his observation post. "Sarge, I counted at least 3 distinct assault waves during the first 2 hours, maybe 40 to 50 men each time. After that, it was infiltration attempts, smaller groups trying to work around the gun's field of fire. None of them made it past 75 yards. The tactical analysis that emerged from combining these observations painted a clear picture of defensive effectiveness multiplied beyond normal expectations. The M1919A4's sustained fire had created a psychological barrier that exceeded its physical capabilities, enemy forces developing such respect for the weapon's lethality that they modified their tactics in ways that actually reduced their effectiveness. Japanese squad leaders, who might have pressed attacks more aggressively instead, chose caution, allowing Stein time to shift fires and engage multiple threats sequentially rather than simultaneously. The machine gun's reputation, built during that first devastating hour of combat, had become a tactical factor that shaped enemy decision-making throughout the remaining engagement. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Griffith arrived at mid-morning with members of his battalion staff, conducting personal reconnaissance of defensive positions that had held against the night's coordinated offensive. His interest in Stein's sector reflected both professional curiosity about defensive tactics and recognition that single weapons had achieved results that normally required platoon-level forces. "Corporal, I'm told you held this sector for 4 hours with 1 machine gun and no reinforcements." The colonel began, studying the kill zone with the analytical eye of an officer who understood both tactics and human limitations. "That's either exceptional marksmanship, exceptional luck, or something about your defensive setup that I need to understand for future operations." Stein gestured toward the fighting holes layout. The carefully positioned ammunition caches, the fields of fire that channeled enemy approaches into predetermined killing zones. So the position was set up to maximize the gun's effective range while minimizing exposure. But honestly, what made the difference was the weapon itself. It kept firing when it should have failed. Everything else was just making sure I had targets to shoot at. The colonel examined the damaged M1919A4 with professional interest. This barrel is stressed beyond any tolerance I've seen on an air-cooled weapon. You're aware that continuing to fire after this level of heat buildup risks catastrophic failure? Yes, sir. But stopping fire risked getting overrun. Seemed like the better risk to take. Griffith nodded slowly, recognizing the tactical logic that had guided Stein's decisions. Your weapon is being sent to Ordnance for evaluation. They're going to want to understand how it functioned under these conditions. In the meantime, you're being reassigned to battalion headquarters for debriefing. Your tactical insights might help other sectors prepare for follow-up attacks. The broader tactical situation across Henderson Field's perimeter was becoming clear as reports from all sectors were compiled and analyzed. Japanese forces had committed approximately 1,500 men to the coordinated offensive, attacking simultaneously at 6 different points in an attempt to overwhelm American defenses through dispersed pressure. The offensive had failed completely, with enemy forces suffering nearly 800 casualties while achieving no significant penetration of the defensive line. Stein's sector represented the highest casualty ratio of any engagement during the night's fighting. 187 confirmed enemy killed versus 0 Marine casualties in his immediate position. The mathematical efficiency was remarkable, but more importantly, it demonstrated that properly positioned defensive weapons could achieve force multiplication far beyond what personnel ratio suggested. The strategic implications extended beyond tactical success. Henderson Field remained fully operational, its runways capable of launching the aircraft that would support offensive operations throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. Japanese forces had expended significant combat strength in an offensive that achieved nothing beyond demonstrating that American defensive positions could not be easily overrun through numerical superiority or tactical aggression. The failure would influence Japanese strategic planning for subsequent operations, introducing caution into decision-making that had previously been characterized by confidence in superior fighting spirit. American forces had proven they could hold defensive positions against overwhelming odds when properly equipped and positioned, a lesson that would shape the remainder of the Pacific campaign. For the Marines who had held the perimeter that night, the tactical lessons were more immediate and personal. Weapons that higher command dismissed as inadequate or outdated had proven decisive when employed by personnel who understood their capabilities. The M1919A4 that Stein had fired for 4 continuous hours was not a perfect weapon, was not suited for every tactical situation. But for defensive operations where sustained fire mattered more than mobility, it had performed beyond any reasonable expectation. The damaged machine gun was transported to the ordnance depot at midday, where weapons technicians could examine it and attempt to understand how an air-cooled design had functioned under thermal stress that should have caused immediate failure. Their analysis would later influence weapon development programs and training doctrine. But for Stein, the technical explanations mattered less than the simple reality that his gun had worked when working was the difference between survival and death. Private First Class Matsuda was reassigned to translation duties, his language skills and combat experience making him valuable for interrogating the handful of Japanese prisoners taken during the night's fighting. Before departing, he stopped at Stein's position one final time, extending his hand in the kind of gesture that communicated respect beyond words. "Corporal, I've been in this campaign since the initial landing, seen a lot of fighting, seen a lot of Marines do incredible things, but I've never seen anyone make one gun do what you did last night. That weapon should have quit on you, but you wouldn't let it." Stein accepted the handshake, recognizing the bond formed by shared combat that transcended rank or assignment. We both made it through. That's what matters. Everything else is just details for the after-action reports. The afternoon brought a visit from Captain James Roosevelt, son of the President and an intelligence officer with the 2nd Raider Battalion. His interest in Stein's defensive action reflected both personal curiosity and professional responsibility for understanding Japanese tactical capabilities and American defensive effectiveness. "Corporal Stein, I'm compiling a tactical assessment of last night's engagement for division headquarters," Roosevelt explained, settling into the fighting hole with the casual disregard for rank that characterized raiders. "Your sector achieved casualty ratios that seem almost impossible given the forces involved. I need to understand whether your success was due to exceptional circumstances or represents something we can replicate across other defensive positions." Stein considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer might influence how future defensive positions were organized and equipped. "Sir, I think 3 things made the difference. First, the position was set up to channel enemy approaches into kill zones where sustained fire was most effective. Second, I had enough ammunition stockpiled that I never had to worry about running dry during critical moments. Third, and most important, the gun itself kept working, despite being pushed beyond any reasonable limit." Roosevelt made notes while absorbing this analysis. "The weapon's performance seems to be the common factor in every account. You're aware that air-cooled machine guns are not supposed to function continuously for 4 hours?" "Yes, sir, but I didn't have a choice about whether to keep firing. The Japanese kept coming, so the gun kept shooting. It's that simple." "Perhaps it is," Roosevelt acknowledged. "Sometimes the simplest explanations are the most accurate. You needed sustained fire. Your weapon provided sustained fire, and the enemy couldn't overcome that firepower, regardless of their numerical advantage." The tactical debriefing continued through the afternoon as various officers sought to understand the defensive engagement from different analytical perspectives. Logistics officers wanted to know about ammunition consumption rates. Intelligence officers were interested in Japanese tactics and coordination. Training officers focused on weapon employment techniques and defensive positioning. Through all these conversations, a consistent picture emerged. Stein's success had resulted from a combination of proper preparation, tactical positioning, determined execution, and a weapon that exceeded its design specifications when circumstances demanded the impossible. No single factor could be isolated as decisive, but the M1919A4's sustained performance remained the foundation that made all other factors relevant. By evening, Marine engineers were already modifying defensive positions throughout the perimeter based on lessons learned from the night's engagement. Fields of fire were adjusted to create better killing zones. Ammunition stockpiles were increased to ensure sustained fire capability. Machine gun positions were reinforced to provide better protection while maintaining offensive effectiveness. The institutional learning that characterized Marine Corps tactical adaptation was incorporating Stein's experience into defensive doctrine that would be applied across the Pacific Theater. One Marine's desperate 4-hour fight was becoming part of the knowledge base that would shape how American forces defended captured territory against Japanese counteroffensives. On November 2nd, 1942, Corporal Tony Stein was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the October 27th engagement. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy Japanese forces at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Corporal Stein, manning a machine gun position with only one assistant, held his sector against repeated enemy assaults for 4 continuous hours, inflicting heavy casualties on attacking forces while preventing breakthroughs that would have compromised the defensive perimeter. His courage, determination, and exceptional marksmanship under extreme combat conditions reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Marine Corps." The formal recognition validated tactical decisions that had been made in desperate circumstances without time for analysis or consideration of alternatives. But for Stein, the medal represented something simpler. Confirmation that refusing to quit when doctrine said failure was inevitable could sometimes achieve results that changed outcomes. The damaged M1919A4 was eventually returned to service after ordnance technicians replaced its barrel and conducted detailed inspections of all internal components. The weapon showed permanent stress marks that would remain throughout its service life, physical evidence of the night it had been pushed beyond any reasonable limit and had somehow survived to continue functioning. Henderson Field remained in American hands throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, its strategic importance growing as Japanese forces were pushed back from the southern Solomon Islands. The airstrip that Stein and thousands of other Marines had defended became the foundation for offensive operations that would eventually reach the Japanese home islands themselves. The tactical lessons learned during that 4-hour engagement influenced defensive doctrine throughout the Pacific War. Machine gun positions were given priority for ammunition resupply. Defensive sectors were designed to maximize sustained fire effectiveness. Training emphasized weapon employment under extreme conditions rather than peacetime specifications. The M1919A4, dismissed by some theorists as inadequate for modern warfare due to its cooling limitations, proved decisive in dozens of defensive engagements where sustained fire mattered more than mobility. The weapon's fundamental reliability, combined with proper tactical employment, created defensive capabilities that multiplied force effectiveness far beyond what personnel numbers suggested. For the Japanese forces that survived the October 27th offensive, the memory of that night's fighting would influence their tactical planning for subsequent operations. The confidence that numerical superiority would overcome American defensive positions had been shattered by encounters where single weapons had inflicted catastrophic casualties. Future attacks would be characterized by greater caution, more extensive preparation, and recognition that American Marines would fight for every yard of ground with determination that defied rational military calculation. The broader strategic picture was shifting decisively in favor of American forces throughout the Pacific theater. The successful defense of Henderson Field marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the southern Solomon Islands. Subsequent operations would be characterized by American advances rather than desperate defensive stands. The Marines, who had held impossible positions during those dark months of 1942, had bought time for reinforcements to arrive, for logistics to improve, for strategic initiative to shift. Corporal Stein's 4-hour fight represented one small piece of this larger transformation. One Marine, one machine gun, one defensive position that held when doctrine said it should fail. The mathematics of combat that suggested numerical superiority would overwhelm defensive firepower had been proven wrong by a weapon that refused to quit, and a Marine who refused to accept that impossible odds meant inevitable defeat. As the sun set over Henderson Field on November 2nd, the airstrip's runways were active with aircraft launching for strikes against Japanese positions deeper in the Solomon Islands chain. The strategic asset that Stein and countless other Marines had defended was now supporting offensive operations that would eventually win the Pacific War. The defensive victories of October had become the foundation for offensive successes that would follow. The machine gun that had achieved the impossible sat in an ordnance depot, its damaged barrel replaced, its stressed components inspected and certified for continued service. The weapon would fight again, would defend other positions, would prove again that obsolete equipment in determined hands could achieve results that newer, more sophisticated systems could not match. And somewhere in the jungle beyond the wire, the ground that had been contested so desperately during 4 hours of darkness remained quiet, marked only by filled-in fighting holes and the scars that high-explosive rounds had left on trees and earth. The tactical terrain that had been so important for one night had returned to strategic insignificance, its value measured only by the fact that Henderson Field remained in American hands because Marines had refused to yield that ground when yielding meant defeat. The story of how one Marine's too slow .30 caliber Browning had wiped out 200 Japanese soldiers in a 4-hour night attack would be repeated in training classes and tactical discussions for decades. Not because the achievement was unique, but because it represented something fundamental about combat effectiveness that transcended technology or doctrine. Weapons worked when soldiers made them work, positions held when Marines refused to abandon them. And sometimes the equipment that theorists dismissed as obsolete proved decisive simply because it was reliable enough to function when functioning mattered most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.